Statistically, you wouldn't have lasted a single day in the Wild West. Before anyone could survive in the American West, they had to get there first, and there was a pretty good chance of dying along the way. Britannica estimates that between the 1840s and 1860s, there were between 300,000 and 400,000 people who headed west on the Oregon Trail alone. Of those, the National Park Service says that 1 in 10 died before they reached the Promised Land. There are almost a shocking number of ways people died, with some of the most common causes being gunshot wounds, accidents, weather-related tragedies, drowning while crossing the trail's multiple rivers, and, of course, dysentery.
What's that?
That's where you poop to your croak.
And those are just the big ones. There were plenty of other risks, too. Rattlesnake bites could turn deadly, and at the time, bison were still all over the place. A stampeding herd could quickly and easily overrun a wagon train, and they did. The animals traveling with the convoy were also a major danger. Most traveled with their own herds, which included oxen, horses, and mules. Beyond riding accidents, people were often kicked or killed in stampedes. And perhaps the most tragic of these deaths are those who fell off wagons and were either crushed by the wheels of their own or other settlers' wagons, or were dragged along behind them. To talk about the likelihood of dying in the Old West, it's absolutely necessary to talk about the people who perished the most. Those were, of course, the Native Americans who had been living on the land for generations. Numbers are hard to come by, but it's estimated North America was home to somewhere between 5 and 15 million people at the end of the 15th century. But by the end of the 19th century, there were less than 238,000 remaining. Just what happened is complicated to sum up. As mentioned, smallpox was particularly devastating and was responsible for a massive death toll. In addition to rampant diseases, a series of wars, including the Battle of Tippecanoe, the War of 1812, and the Seminole Wars, further decreased numbers, along with outright massacres like the Sand Creek Massacre. Then there were forced relocations like the Trail of Tears, which killed thousands of Native Americans in the 1830s, where natives were forced to leave their ancestral homelands and walk more than 1,000 miles to land that the U.S. government decided they could live on, meaning that tragically, the Native Americans who survived the Old West were the exception and not the norm. Historian David Dari wrote Frontier Medicine, a book that gave a disturbing look into what being a doctor in the Old West meant, both for the doctors and their patients. It's truly grim stuff, and he found that doctors were largely making things up as they went, frequently prescribing cures that did more damage than the illness or injury.
I had a cold a couple years ago. I went in there. You know what he said to me? He goes, "Oh, you need an ear nail." A nail in my ear.
And tragically, due to cultural bias, white doctors often scoffed at the medicinal knowledge of Native American tribes, a treasure trove of information that could have done some real good. There were essentially 3 options for anyone who was sick or injured: waiting for a doctor, treating their own problems, or just giving up the ghost. If the doctor showed up, he might perform a bloodletting or administer a weird medicine like the 1815 cure for arthritis and gout. That involved killing a dog, filling the body with things like turpentine, brimstone, and nettles, and roasting it over an open fire, and just breathe in the fumes and you're cured, or not. It's no wonder then that many turned to self-medicating for chronic conditions. One of these people was the famous gambler Doc Holliday. Forrest Tennant MD says that he self-medicated with opium and alcohol when he developed tuberculosis, and while he lived longer than expected, he was also regularly coughing up chunks of his lungs. The dangers of drinking too much are well documented, and in the Old West, it wasn't just what they were drinking, but how much as well, starting with the fact that according to True West magazine, it wasn't an uncommon sight to see a teenager in a saloon drinking with adults. Arizona's official historian Marshall Trimble says that before many hit 16 years of age, they would be classified as severe alcoholics by today's standards. According to historian W.J. Rarabaugh, peoples of all ages, including toddlers, were starting the day with a stiff drink and ending with a nightcap, beginning as far back as the 1700s. Alcohol use reached a peak in the 1800s, thanks in large part to massive corn crops and the profitability of turning that into whiskey. Basically, everyone was drinking all the time, and by 1830, intake was astronomical. Let's put it this way. If someone today were to start drinking like someone in the 1830s, and we're certainly not recommending that you do, they'd be drinking 3.5 bottles of whiskey every week. Research from the book Alcohol and Opium in the Old West says that drinking was seen as a perfectly acceptable pastime, so much so that abuse and addiction would ultimately lead to the temperance movement and prohibition. There were plenty of cold nights in the Old West, and countless men headed into the arms of these so-called painted ladies and soiled doves in search of companionship. Unfortunately, this whole industry was set up in such a way that it almost guaranteed a shortened life for both the women and their clients. Christopher Knowlton did a deep dive into the sex work industry on the frontier for his book Cattle Kingdom: The Hidden History of the Cowboy West, and he discovered that once women got into the industry, there was little to no chance of getting out. Most died young of conditions made worse by things like disease, addiction, and poverty. According to Medicine in the Old West, some estimates suggest that about 50% of the West's sex workers had some sort of venereal disease, which was spread to the clients. They did take precautions, but it's easy to see how repeatedly using solutions containing chemicals like mercury, carbolic acid, mercuric cyanide, and boric acid might have been more than a little dangerous. It's unclear how many people died of venereal diseases from that time because the cause of death was often listed on death certificates as something other than venereal disease. Often it was called cancer of the brain because of the decay that late-stage syphilis caused. All in all, it just wasn't a very fun time to be alive. It's no secret that some days are only survived by being able to kick back with a good cocktail. But in the Old West, that cocktail at the end of a hard day could mean the end of your life. Most Westerns might show cowboys and outlaws alike sidling up to the bar and ordering a whiskey from the town saloon. But according to the Tahoe Daily Tribune, in addition to locally brewed beers and plain old whiskey, saloons were much more likely to be serving up drinks like the potentially deadly tarantula juice.
Hey, Marshall, here's...
Drinking it allegedly caused those who consumed it to lash out violently because it contained the deadly and hallucinogenic strychnine. The drink got that chill-inducing name because those who frequently partook of it often complained of feeling like they were covered in crawling spiders. The CDC says that only small amounts of strychnine are needed to cause strychnine poisoning and death. However, strychnine wasn't the only questionable substance in alcohol in those days. In many saloons, it was all about stretching liquor as far as they could and raising profits, which meant many saloons were cutting their liquors and serving customers a potentially deadly mix of booze, gunpowder, turpentine, and even ammonia. So with that said, down the hatch.
Damn it, no!
The Crusades were a pretty violent time for Europe and the Middle East. Tragically, though, the violence isn't the only thing that would kill you if you lived during that era. If you're going to live during the Crusades, it's probably best to be an iconic king or a legendary warrior. This was the era of King Richard I, Saladin, the Knights Templar, and the Ismaili assassins who inspired the Assassin's Creed games, after all. Perhaps being legendary would even help you survive, sort of like the main character in a movie. Well, King Baldwin IV was also legendary, but he had leprosy and died before the age of 25. Many of the other legends didn't do so well either. Richard the Lionheart of the Third Crusade faced deadly storms and the even deadlier Saladin.
I am not those men. I am Salahuddin.
King Richard died warring with his former co-crusader, King Philip II. While overseeing a siege, Richard caught a crossbow bolt to the arm and died from a wound infection. Meanwhile, Saladin, the Great Sultan, brilliant architect of the Battle of Hattin and conqueror of Jerusalem, likely died of typhoid fever. The stealthy Nizari Ismailis changed history by assassinating Conrad of Montferrat before he could be crowned King of Jerusalem. But they were destroyed by the Mongols in the 1250s. And the Knights Templar? They were skilled bankers and ferocious fighters, but after losing the last Crusader stronghold in 1291, they also lost favor with King Philip IV, who owed them money. Philip tortured Templars and burned dozens of them at the stake for made-up crimes. War is always hell, even when a pope proposes it. It is also the most obvious thing that could kill you during the Crusades. What might not be obvious is just how violent warfare could be. When Crusader forces finally captured Jerusalem in 1099, they massacred just about everyone inside. According to the New York Times, men, women, and children were killed. There was apparently so much blood flowing in the streets that it was ankle deep. Jews, who defended the city alongside their Muslim neighbors, were locked in their synagogue, which was set on fire. And if you happen to live in the Byzantine capital of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, there's a good chance you'd be slaughtered not by Muslims, but by the Crusaders who were supposed to be your allies. According to the Ancient History Encyclopedia, deep distrust and religious tensions between Holy Roman and Byzantine empires led Crusaders to sack Constantinople, looting and murdering as they went. The bloodshed was so intense that it was said the blood flowed through the streets of the city like a river for days. Let's say you embark on the First Crusade in 1096. The Pope has promised that if you die in combat, all your sins will be forgiven and you'll go to heaven. If you're a knight, that's very convenient because you also fight in non-holy wars, which are considered sinful. Plus, if you don't fight, you'll be branded a coward. If you're a peasant, you're worried about going to hell not for who you fight, but for what you eat. According to National Geographic, Famine ravaged France before the Crusades, killing thousands of peasants. Many of those peasants resorted to cannibalism as they embarked on an unorganized crusade that was easily defeated by Turkish forces. A second, more successful group of crusaders also struggled with hunger. As the Telegraph explained, 4,500 knights were joined by 35,000 people fleeing famine and poverty without weapons or even shoes. It would take 3 years to reach Jerusalem, and if you didn't die on the way, you still had to scrounge for food. According to eyewitness accounts, Crusader cannibalism was so rampant that they were seen placing body parts on spits out in the open. In the spring of 1138, the Syrian city of Aleppo faced a siege. In the fall, after that siege was abandoned, it faced something far worse. In October of that year, a massive earthquake reduced parts of the city to rubble. According to Britannica.com, the quake leveled the citadel, killing hundreds. It also wrecked surrounding towns, destroying a Crusader fortress and a Muslim fort. An estimated 230,000 people died in the disaster. Earthquakes were a bigger problem during the time of the Crusades than you might think. In addition to dealing with dehydration, starvation, sickness, or arrows to the spleen, you also had to worry about the ground shaking beneath your feet. According to the book Medicine in the Crusades, more than a dozen earthquakes may have occurred in the era of the Frankish Crusader states, which were situated along the Dead Sea Fault system. Another powerful quake rocked Antioch in 1115, collapsing walls and scaring people so much that some of them jumped off buildings. If you managed to get to the Crusades without dying along the way, and you didn't die in battle, then the doctor tending to your wounds might kill you. After all, the Crusades took place during the Middle Ages, when medicine was still very crude. This was a time when infant mortality was sky high, mothers consistently died during childbirth, and doctors treated mental illness through barbaric methods. Battlefield medicine was especially rough. According to NBC News, a doctor at a Crusader hospital once amputated a fighter's leg because of a small infected wound. That patient died. Doctors had it rough too. A paper published by the National Center for Biotechnology Information recounted how one crusading nobleman wouldn't let doctors make potions for fear that he'd be poisoned. This kind of fear led to doctors being executed for simply trying to practice medicine. While we'd like to imagine it as a cultured and sophisticated society, there's absolutely no way you'd survive life in ancient Greece for long. Here's why. Around 1177 BC, several civilizations fell, including the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the early Greek civilizations like the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Cities were sacked and burned, trade routes abandoned. In a letter, Babylonian king Hammurabi described the scenario like this: "Behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." No one's really sure who these enemies were, but they do know a great many people met a grisly end at the hands of a group of raiders known only as the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records tell tall tales of a mysterious people who laid waste to the entire area. It seems as though they first showed up alongside the Hittites. Strangely, no one recorded who they were or exactly where they came from. They fought in Egypt and the Mediterranean for centuries, destroying entire cities and settlements and then moving on. And then these mysterious pirates fell out of Egyptian history in 1178 BC. Sparta is widely considered to be the most militaristic of the Greek city-states. At the height of its power, around 404 BC, the city of Sparta didn't even have walls. Inhabitants evidently felt that they didn't need them because they had Spartans. When it comes to Sparta, figuring out what's real and what's fiction can be tough. We know the land in Sparta was very fertile, and not having to worry about food meant that people could focus on other hobbies, like poetry and bloody battle.
This is Sparta!
Sparta's militaristic bent began when it managed to conquer the neighboring land of Messenia, turning its inhabitants into slaves. Boys were trained from the age of 7 to 20, and they were basically expected to be resistant to hunger and cold, despite having given precious little in the way of food, clothing, or supplies. If they were suspected of having any kind of disability, the Spartans would kill them, usually when they were infants. According to National Geographic, the only time these slaves got a break from training was when they were actually at war. According to the BBC, the ancient Greeks took a minimalist approach to makeup. They didn't want the cosmetics to appear obvious. They just wanted their skin to look healthy. Unfortunately, these cosmetics were made from lead and mercury. In fact, such powders were used well into the 19th century. According to University College London, that's when women started using much more of the stuff and the damaging effects became quite apparent. Blackened skin, baldness, even damaged teeth. According to NBC News, both men and women in ancient Greece took to wearing lead face cream, which was believed to help keep their complexions clear and even improve the condition of their skin. It did neither, of course. According to punishment in ancient Athens, people were often punished by society out of sheer anger. Anyone could bring charges against anyone else. About 96% of surviving court documents feature cases in which one person simply hated the other. By the time both parties were in court, it was the prosecutor's job to make the jury feel equally angry so that punishment could be handed out and supposed justice served. Suffice it to say, the laws of ancient Greece could be incredibly brutal. In the 7th century BC, Athens asked an aristocrat named Draco to draft a new set of laws. This fellow is why we use the word draconian to describe particularly brutal laws. He was, in short, a complete and utter jerk. As Encyclopedia Britannica explains it, draconian laws were said to be written in blood rather than ink. Death was prescribed for almost all criminal offenses. Think you would have survived these harsh laws? You likely would have been sentenced to death for such arrogance.